If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. Winter 1943, Chelyabinsk Oblast. The wind outside carried the kind of cold that made iron scream. Snow was piled against the brick walls of the small tank factory, and frost crawled up every window. Inside, the light came from a mix of dim electric bulbs and welding arcs that flickered like brief lightning in the smoky air. Every sound echoed: the hiss of gas, the crack of hammer on metal, the low hum of a generator struggling against the cold. Irina Volkova worked near the end of the assembly line, her face half hidden behind a worn welding mask. She was 31, short and wiry, her hands rough from both farming and labor. 2 years earlier, she'd been a farmer's wife, tending wheat fields beside her husband on the Volga plains. When the Germans advanced, he was drafted. His last letter came 6 months ago. The envelope smelled faintly of oil and gunpowder. After that, nothing. The authorities closed the farm and sent her east, like thousands of others, to fill the gaps in the war industry. Her task was simple on paper: weld the armor plates that formed the T-34's hull. But she was no trained welder. Every movement came from instinct and repetition, learned under pressure. Her hands shook slightly when she started the torch each morning, a small tremor she never admitted to anyone. The foreman shouted at her often, said her seams looked crooked, uneven. She didn't argue. She just nodded, lowered her mask, and started again. The air was heavy with heat and metal dust. Sparks bounced off her coat and died in the folds of fabric. Each time she lifted the torch, she could hear her own heartbeat under the noise. There was no room for mistakes, yet her fear of failing was constant. She tried to remember her husband's voice. He used to fix plows, said the metal only obeyed those who respected it. That thought steadied her more than any instruction manual. By midday, her shoulders burned. The supervisor walked past, inspecting the weld lines, muttering something about sloppy work. She swallowed the anger that rose in her throat. These men had families to return to. She had no one left. So she worked quietly, determined to do better. Not for praise, but because every plate she touched would end up on a tank driven by someone else's husband. When the shift ended, she sat alone near the back wall. Her gloves steamed from the heat of the welds. Around her, other workers smoked, talked, and laughed weakly. She didn't join them. Her mind drifted to the news bulletins pinned on the wall. Photos of soldiers in front of wrecked tanks, their armor split open like tin. She wondered if one of those tanks had carried her husband. The thought made her stomach tighten. She forced herself to focus on her hands instead, on the calluses, on the black stains that wouldn't wash away. Outside, the sky had already gone dark. The snowstorm thickened, and the faint sound of sirens rolled in from the city center. Irina didn't move. She stared at the half-finished T-34 beside her, the steel plates still warm from her work. To her, it wasn't just machinery. It was proof that she still mattered, even if no one remembered her name. When the factory lights dimmed for the night, she removed her mask slowly, leaving a pale band of clean skin across her face. For a moment, she looked at her reflection in a piece of polished metal. Tired eyes, soot-covered cheeks, a face that belonged to someone who hadn't smiled in years. She wasn't proud of her welds. They were crooked, imperfect, but deep down, she believed they would hold. She stood, picked up her coat, and stepped outside into the blizzard. The wind hit her like a slap, stealing her breath. She didn't know that by the next week, a wounded officer named Major Mikhail Sokolov would arrive at the factory, and that her wrong, weld lines would soon change the course of her life and the survival of countless men she'd never meet. That night, she only thought of one thing. She had to be back by dawn. Another tank waited, and the war didn't stop for anyone. The morning began in silence, the kind that always followed a long night of air raid alerts. The sky was gray, and the factory floor glowed faintly under the weak bulbs strung along the ceiling. Workers moved slower than usual. The heat from the furnaces hadn't reached full strength, and their breath still turned to mist. Irina was already at her station, adjusting her mask and torch, her eyes tired but alert. The night before, she'd barely slept. The foreman's complaints about her welds echoed in her mind, but so did the strange sense that she might be doing something right. The factory had been warned to expect an inspector from the front. No one knew who. That morning, he arrived without fanfare. A man in a worn officer's coat, the collar lined with faded fur, the fabric marked by grease and burns. Major Mikhail Sokolov. He didn't look like the usual bureaucrats who came to measure quotas. His left sleeve hung stiffly, and his walk had a quiet limp. A jagged scar crossed his wrist, visible even under his gloves. He moved through the workshop without saying much, nodding to the foreman, scanning the lines, and stopping occasionally to run his fingers over finished hulls. Irina noticed him only when he reached her section. Her first instinct was tension. Her stomach tightened, expecting criticism. He watched her work in silence for a while. The hiss of the torch, the bright arc, her slow, deliberate movements. Then he spoke, his voice even but rough, like a man used to shouting over engines. "You welded these seams?" She nodded, pulling up her mask. "Yes, Comrade Major." He crouched beside the plate, tracing the uneven lines with a gloved hand. "You know these are off-pattern?" "I follow the marks," she said quickly. Maybe the template moved. He didn't answer immediately. His expression stayed unreadable. After a few seconds, he turned to the foreman. "Prepare one of her plates for impact testing." The foreman looked confused, even slightly annoyed. "Major, these are not standard." "I know," Mikhail interrupted, standing slowly. "That's why I want it tested." The rest of the day passed in silence. Workers whispered. Some said she'd be fired. Others joked that she'd slowed down production. Irina stayed at her station, pretending not to hear. Inside, fear mixed with confusion. Why test her work? Why draw attention to her mistakes? She thought about her husband, about the pride he'd carried for doing his duty even when it meant death. She wondered if she'd failed hers before it had even begun. That evening, Mikhail oversaw the test himself. The sound of the cannon echoed across the snowfield behind the factory. Workers gathered near the observation post, squinting through the smoke. One shell struck the welded plate. The metal shook but didn't crack. A second hit followed. The seam held. A third still intact. The foreman's mouth opened, but no words came out. Mikhail watched closely, his eyes narrowing as the smoke cleared. He didn't celebrate. He just turned to Irina, who stood frozen, unsure whether to smile or apologize. "What pattern did you use?" he asked. She hesitated. "I don't know. I just weld the way it feels strongest." He nodded slowly, studying her. "Keep doing it that way." That night, she couldn't eat. Her hands trembled when she removed her gloves, realizing that what she'd done out of error might have saved lives. For the first time, she felt noticed, not for being a widow filling a quota, but for something that mattered. Later, while the factory quieted, Mikhail sat alone in the small office beside the main floor. He reviewed the test data by lamplight, tracing the weld pattern on the diagrams. He'd seen too many tanks burn from clean, perfect seams that cracked under stress. Maybe this woman's instinct had found something the manuals never did. He looked out the window. Through the frost, he could see Irina cleaning her tools, her movements slow but precise. He recognized something in her, an exhaustion he understood well. She wasn't there for recognition. Neither was he. They were both trying to keep something alive in a world that destroyed everything it touched. When he left the office, he passed her without a word. Still, she noticed the brief nod he gave. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. A small, quiet sign that her work had meaning. And in that moment, for the first time since the war began, Irina felt something close to hope. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the sound of distant artillery from the west. The war was still moving toward them, but inside that small factory, something had shifted. Not victory, not relief, just the faint beginning of trust between two people who'd almost forgotten what that felt like. The days after the test changed the rhythm of the factory. No official order came, but the welders began to copy Irina's uneven seams. The foreman pretended it had been his idea all along, and production moved faster than before. Only Major Mikhail Sokolov knew where the idea had truly come from, and he said nothing. He simply observed, taking quiet notes, making adjustments, and walking the line like a man who had found a small piece of order in the chaos of war. Irina noticed his presence more often now. He didn't interfere with her work, but he always appeared near her station toward the end of each shift. Sometimes he helped move heavy armor plates, even though his injured arm limited him. Once, when she offered to help, he refused gently. "Don't. I still have one good arm." His voice carried neither pride nor pity, just practicality. That tone, plain and grounded, made her trust him. The factory never slept. The noise was constant, metal striking metal, torches burning, engines testing. Workers came and went in 12-hour rotations. The smell of oil clung to their clothes. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, muting everything except the war itself. No letters arrived anymore. No news from the front. Only the distant rumble of artillery, a low reminder that survival was temporary. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Mikhail entered the workshop during a power shortage. The main lamps had failed, leaving only the glow of welding arcs to light the room. Irina worked alone at her corner, her torch reflecting off the frost-covered walls. He stood behind her for a while, watching her movements, steady, careful, different from the rushed, sloppy welders nearby. When she lifted her mask, startled by his presence, he handed her a cigarette. "Take a break," he said quietly. She hesitated, but took it. They stood near the doorway, smoke rising into the cold air. Neither spoke for a long time. It was the kind of silence that said more than conversation could. Finally, she asked, "You were at the front?" He nodded once. "Mechanic. I kept tanks alive as long as I could." She looked at his arm. And then, a shell hit our position. The fire spread before we could move. His eyes didn't shift. Most didn't make it out. She said nothing, but her breath caught slightly. The sound of welding resumed in the distance, muffled and hollow. He glanced at her torch. "What did you learn?" "Farming tools," she replied. "Plows, carts, broken gates. Metal doesn't scare me." She paused, then added, "Losing people does." That answer stayed with him. From that night, something changed between them. Their interactions remained professional, but there was a wordless understanding, a sense that both carried wounds too deep for talk. A few days later, a young welder named Petrov collapsed during an air raid drill. The alarms blared, workers scattered, and in the confusion, a fuel canister toppled and caught fire. Irina rushed forward instinctively, dragging Petrov away while Mikhail and others smothered the flames. When it was over, the boy survived, coughing but alive. Irina's hands were burned from the heat. Mikhail found her afterward in the empty corridor, sitting with her gloves off, staring at her blistered skin. He knelt beside her. "You should go to the infirmary." "I'll lose my shift," she muttered. "We're behind already." He frowned. "They can weld without you for one night." She looked at him, eyes red from smoke. "No, they can't." There was no argument after that. He simply nodded, understanding the stubbornness that came from loss. Later that night, after the others had gone, Irina stayed to finish Petrov's section. Mikhail joined her, bringing a small oil lamp to light the space. The two worked together, she welding, he adjusting the clamps. The only sounds were the hiss of flame and the wind outside. When the shift ended, he turned off the lamp. For a brief second, their faces were lit only by the orange afterglow of the steel. It was quiet, almost peaceful. She noticed the fatigue in his eyes, the same exhaustion she felt. Both of them had been running on duty, not hope. Before leaving, he said, "If you ever need rest, take it. The war doesn't end if one tank is late." She looked at him, her voice steady. "But someone might die if it is." He said nothing more. Outside, the snowstorm had eased. They walked toward the barracks in silence, their shadows long under the weak lamps. The distance between them was respectful, but something unspoken had settled there. Trust built not from words, but from the simple fact that both kept showing up, night after night, when others would have walked away. Neither of them knew that this quiet connection, their shared silence, would soon be tested harder than steel. The front was getting closer, and before long, the war would reach their factory gates. By the end of February, the snow around the factory had turned black from soot. The workers spoke less each day, their faces pale from exhaustion. The war had grown louder. Rumors said the German bombers were crossing the Urals now, that nothing was safe anymore. But production didn't stop. Orders from Moscow demanded another 50 tanks before spring. For Irina and Mikhail, the days had blurred into one long stretch of labor and silence. They barely left the factory anymore. Irina's burns were still healing beneath her gloves, but she kept welding. Mikhail had begun working beside her most nights, pretending it was for supervision, though everyone knew he was there to make sure she ate and rested. They shared coffee brewed from burnt barley, sat on overturned crates, and spoke only when necessary. The bond between them had deepened into quiet reliance, the kind forged not by romance, but by surviving the same cold, the same fear. Then, one afternoon, the sirens came. Not a drill this time. The sound was different, longer, sharper, almost panicked. The workers froze mid-motion, glancing toward the windows. A foreman shouted, "To the shelters!" But the engines of the bombers were already audible, a low, rolling thunder from the west. The first explosion hit the far end of the compound. Dust fell from the ceiling, glass shattered, and the lights went out. Irina stumbled, dropping her mask. Sparks flared from a half-welded hull beside her. The ground shook again. Men and women ran for cover, tripping over cables and debris. Amid the noise, she saw one of the unfinished tanks still open, the last of their production batch. It needed 2 more seams to be complete. Without them, it couldn't hold armor plating. She looked around for help, but the floor was already emptying. Her mind raced. If the shelling reached the fuel tanks, everything would burn. But if that T-34 wasn't finished, it would never make it to the front. She grabbed her torch and went back to work. Moments later, a shadow moved through the smoke. Mikhail. He was shouting something, but the roar of the planes drowned his voice. He reached her, grabbed her arm. "You can't stay here." She pulled free, her eyes fixed on the welding seam. "I'm almost done. Are you insane? They're hitting the compound." "I don't care. This one goes out." He hesitated, watching her hands shake as she forced the molten seam into place. Then he did something she didn't expect. He picked up another torch and joined her. His bad arm made every movement slow, but he worked beside her anyway. Together they welded through the smoke, their eyes squinting against sparks and falling debris. The building trembled, heat rolling through the floor. A blast tore through the eastern wall, the air filled with dust and flame. Irina ducked as fragments flew past, one cutting across her sleeve. She smelled burning cloth, but kept going. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Mikhail shouted again, "That's it, enough." She didn't answer. The last seam was glowing, almost finished. He saw her hands blistering under the heat and moved to steady her grip. Their gloves touched briefly, and for a moment, there was no noise, no bombs, only the hiss of molten steel cooling into place. The final weld sealed. Mikhail hit the release lever. The crane arm above them dropped the armor plate into position, locking it down. The tank was complete. Around them, fire spread across the rafters. The roof began to sag. He pulled her toward the exit as another explosion split the far wall open. Snow and ash poured inside like a storm. Together they ran through the smoke, ducking under beams, stumbling past twisted metal. When they burst into the courtyard, the cold struck them hard. Flames glowed behind the shattered windows, lighting up the night sky in orange and black. Workers stood scattered in the snow, staring helplessly at what remained of the plant. Irina bent over, coughing, her gloves smoking. Mikhail's face was streaked with soot and blood from a cut across his forehead. Neither spoke. Then, through the noise of distant bombs, came the deep rumble of an engine. They both turned. The last T-34, the one they'd finished minutes earlier, rolled out through the broken gate, its tracks grinding through snow and ash. Someone inside revved it high, steering it clear of the collapsing walls. It moved slowly but alive, the metal gleaming under firelight. Mikhail watched it with disbelief. It held, he muttered. Irina stood beside him, chest heaving, her eyes wide. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The rest of the factory burned through the night. Fire crews arrived too late to save most of it. But the records showed that one tank, Unit 2473, had survived the bombing intact and was sent directly to the front. No one mentioned the two welders who stayed behind to finish it. At dawn, Irina and Mikhail sat on a rail car near the smoking ruins, wrapped in blankets handed out by the medics. Her hands were raw, his arm bandaged again, but they were alive. The war would move on. New factories would take over. But the look they exchanged in that silent morning light said what neither could voice. They had done something that mattered. For the first time since the war began, Irina felt the warmth of pride, not the kind shouted in speeches, but the quiet kind that lives between people who risked everything for something no one would ever know. She leaned back against the cold metal, watching the sun rise through the haze, and said softly, "It'll hold again." Mikhail turned toward her, a faint smile hidden behind exhaustion. "It will." And somewhere far beyond the horizon, the tank they built together was already heading into battle. Weeks passed after the bombing. The wrecked factory near Chelyabinsk stood half buried in snow, its roof collapsed and windows sealed with wooden planks. Only one corner remained active, the repair shed, where survivors tried to salvage whatever equipment they could. The war reports said the front had stabilized near Kursk, but no one believed such words anymore. The truth was simple. Every working machine mattered, and every pair of hands that could still lift the torch was kept at the line. Irina was one of the few who stayed. Her burns had healed into faint scars along her wrists, but she ignored them. Each day, she arrived early, checking the leftover materials, cleaning the soot from surviving machines, and helping rebuild the furnace room. The factory no longer built full tanks, only spare armor and replacement hulls for trains carrying damaged T-34s back from the front. Mikhail was still there, too. His uniform had been replaced by a patched worker's coat, and though his injury hadn't fully healed, he refused transfer. He moved slower now, with a deliberate steadiness that kept the younger workers focused. At first, they didn't talk much. They worked side by side in silence, as they always had. The air between them was calm, but heavy with things unspoken. What they'd lost, what they'd seen, and what they still carried. Then, one afternoon, a telegram arrived. It was addressed to Major Sokolov, but marked for factory command. Irina found him reading it near the furnace. His expression was unreadable at first, then quietly changed into something she hadn't seen before: relief. He handed her the paper. The message was brief. Tank Unit 2473 survived direct combat. Crew alive. Armor integrity exceptional. Commendation pending. For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of hammers and drills filled the distance. Irina traced the paper with her gloved fingers. "It was that one." He nodded. "The one we finished that night." She exhaled slowly, realizing that the uneven seams she'd once been scolded for had saved men's lives. The welds weren't wrong. They were stronger than the manuals predicted. Her mistake had become a weapon of endurance. That night, after the shift ended, Mikhail found her sitting near the open doorway, her coat pulled tight against the cold. Outside, the wind carried the faint hum of freight trains heading west, loaded with new armor. He sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. For a while, they just listened to the trains, their sound fading into the distance. He spoke first. They wanted to go back to the front. Advisor position. She turned to him, her breath visible in the chill air. "Will you?" "I haven't decided." He paused, looking down at his bandaged hand. "Part of me thinks I should, but the truth is, I'm tired of seeing what's left after fire." Irina understood. Her voice was quiet. "You've done enough." He looked at her, the faint light from the furnace flickering across his face. "So have you." A long silence settled between them. It wasn't awkward. It was the same silence they had worked through, fought through, survived through. The war had taken everything that made life simple. Yet in that emptiness, they had found something that didn't break. When spring came, The reconstruction teams began moving people out of temporary quarters. The government announced that Chelyabinsk would rebuild a new, larger plant. Workers were given the choice to relocate or return home. Irina stood outside the manager's office, reading the notice. Her name was on the list. For the first time in 2 years, she could leave. But when she thought of the word home, there was nothing left to imagine. No farm, no husband, just a patch of frozen land somewhere under occupation. She folded the paper and looked toward the workshop, where Mikhail was loading spare parts onto a truck. Later that day, she approached him. "They're assigning new teams to Sverdlovsk," she said. "They need welders." He nodded. "And I might go. They said it's peaceful there." He didn't try to stop her. Instead, he placed his tools down carefully, turned toward her, and said, "If you go, make sure they don't teach you to weld straight. Leave it crooked." She smiled faintly for the first time in months. "That I can promise." When she left Chelyabinsk, snow was melting off the rail lines, and the air smelled faintly of oil and wet earth. Mikhail helped her carry her small suitcase to the platform. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. The way they looked at each other, steady, honest, said everything that words couldn't. "Take care of your hands," he said quietly. "You too," she replied. "They're still needed." The train pulled away slowly, steam curling into the sky. Mikhail stood on the platform long after it disappeared, his breath mixing with the cold. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the past pressing on him. Somewhere out there, a tank he helped build was still fighting. Somewhere further, a woman who once welded by instinct had found her purpose again. Months later, in the late summer of 1943, word reached the Chelyabinsk plant that the Battle of Kursk had ended in Soviet victory. Among the reports came a small note, a commendation for an unorthodox welding design that improved T-34 armor endurance. It had no names attached. The credit went to the factory collective. Mikhail read it quietly, folded it once, and kept it in his coat pocket. Years later, when peace finally came, Irina and Mikhail would meet again, not in a factory, but on a small farm rebuilt near the old rail line. He arrived with tools and supplies, she with a repaired stove and horse cart. There were no grand speeches or embraces. Just two survivors standing in the soft light of evening, aware that they had both chosen to stay alive, and that was enough. In the final shot, the camera would linger on the horizon, a rebuilt field, a quiet home, and a pair of hands that no longer trembled when they touched metal. The war had taken much, but what remained was unbreakable. The armor held, not just in the steel they made, but in the people who refused to fall apart. And for the first time since the world went dark, Irina Volkova allowed herself to smile. Not as a worker or a widow, but as someone who had finally survived.